Welcome to the Life Self-Mastery Podcast, where we bring in entrepreneurs who have created online businesses and improved their lifestyles. Here's your host, Rohit Malhotra.
Hi everyone, I'm Rohit from Life Self-Mastery, and today I'm excited to have Matt Wallaert, who's a behavioral scientist and entrepreneur working at the intersection of technology and human behavior, designing products and programs that help people live happier, healthier lives. After leaving academia to build and sell two successful startups, he became Microsoft's first behavioral scientist and a director at Microsoft Ventures. He's now the chief behavioral officer at Clover Health, a Medicare Advantage plan, changing the model of insurance by changing behavior. He speaks frequently on the science of behavior change and product design and sits on the board of several startups and nonprofits. He has written a new book, Startup in How to Build Profits That Create Change, which is releasing on the 11th of June. And a huge thank you to Lillian Ball from Penguin Random House for organizing this interview. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Rohit.
Awesome. So, can you talk about your journey? How did you get into this crazy world of startups, and what made you get interested into behavioral science?
Yeah, so I had kind of an interesting background. I came from a very rural part of America, and I think psychology in the U.S. at least is often sort of taught to us by media, right? We see movies and television where somebody lies on a couch and talks to a psychologist, or we watch The Sopranos of the world, and that's our vision of psychology, right? This sort of talk therapy. Right. But when I was in college, I got exposed to social psychology and a very different way of psychology as a science for looking at why we do what we do in an organized way, and that was really appealing to me. I have always been interested in sort of creating change, and it sort of lucked into a field where I could do that in a systematic and programmatic way, which is really appeals to my personality. I think if I got exposed to something like design, where there isn't as much of a sort of emphasis on experimentation and data, I don't think I would have ended up where I am. I happen to find something that appealed to my personality, and I certainly didn't. Although my parents might disagree, I don't think of myself as having like an entrepreneurial bone in my body. My parents love to fill in stories from my childhood where I used to figure out different ways of having little businesses and making money, but I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I very much thought of myself as a scientist. And then I had a really unique experience when I was in grad school and getting my PhD, where a startup sort of came to me and sort of said, "Hey, will you sit on our advisory board and give us some advice?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know anything about business." And they said, "That's okay. We do. You know something about science, and that's something we don't know about." And so that was I had a sort of an interesting entree into entrepreneurship because I didn't know anything about it. And so that was actually sort of it was a strange experience. I remember actually maybe like 2 weeks into the job, walking through the West Village in New York with the founder and saying, "What's a basis point? Because you guys have given me these basis points, and I don't know what a basis point is," right? Like the whole concept of equity was entirely foreign to me. I was just overjoyed that as a grad student, they were paying me $60,000, right? Like as a grad student, I'm like, I have reached the promised land, $60,000. I remember like running around the grad building, hugging people. Like I was so excited about this offer, right? And I paid no attention whatsoever to the equity portion of it. And I actually think that helped me get into entrepreneurship. I think one of the things that really is hard for the current generation is people want to be entrepreneurs. And that's to me, that's a weird thing. Entrepreneurship is a method to solving a particular kind of problem. Right. But saying that you want to be an entrepreneur when you're 20 years old, I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what I think it means in their mind. I think I know what it means, the values it represents to them and stuff. But I don't think I know what it means from an actual rubber meets the road practicality. Are you an entrepreneur if you're not a founder? If you're the 10th employee, are you an entrepreneur? What does that actually mean? I get so many young people who are like, "Well, I want to be my own boss." And I'm like, how would you know? You've never had a boss. Yeah. How can you know that you want to be your own boss when you've never had a boss in your life?
Correct. And so, you left academia and you built and sold to successful startups. So, what were the startups about?
Yeah, so the first one I joined a startup called Thrive. It was co-founded by a guy named Avi Karnani. Man, like it's too early in the morning here in the US. I can't remember the name of the CTO. Ori Schnaps. There we go. Poor Ori. So Ori and Avi got together and built this company, and I came on sort of as the head of product. And we had a great experience and exited to LendingTree. And then we were at LendingTree for a while after, sort of transitionally as one expects. And then Avi and I went on to found a company called Churnless that did sort of applied behavioral science interventions in the early days. And so I've been tremendously lucky. So much of success is just about timing.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I love, there's this, I was talking to a guy, I think from Kleiner Perkins at one point, and he told a really great story, and I'm gonna totally screw it up. But they had a like mobile only fund, and all they were like, their thesis was, I think it was like $100 million, a big fund, and it was like, we're only going to invest in like the best of mobile apps, and so it was like the right thesis, but they were just literally like 2 years too early. I'll make up the dates, I can't remember what they were, but they were like, the fund invested in like 6, 7, and like Uber and everything that really went huge in mobile was like 8, 9, right? And so they were like just slightly too early. And so I always, sort of think of my career as having been very much a product of timing. I got into behavioral science just, sort of as the rest of the world woke up and figured out that it might be a thing. And maybe still slightly too early, right? At 37, I'm a chief behavioral officer, right? Like, I think it would be easier to be a C if I like was in my 40s and had more gray hair. But like, it's coming right along at that right moment, I think was interesting. And so entrepreneurship for me has very much been a journey of timing more than anything else.
Yeah, I totally believe that, luck is an important factor. I believe if Google Maps had not been there for Uber, you never know, would it have worked or not? But we'll come to Uber later on. But in the book you talk about purpose of a product is to change behavior. So should one focus on processes or outcomes? For somebody who's listening to the podcast is a product manager, what should he focus on?
Yeah, I think he or she should focus on outcomes, right? I think that one of the big problems, the book is called Start at the End for a reason, right? I think one of the big problems with the modern product process is we very much start with an idea of what we want to build rather than an idea of what we want to be true because we built something, right? And if you just, I think at this point it's uncontroversial, although someone can sort of argue with me about it, but like, you have to know that what you want is a hole to end up building a shovel, right? And if you just start with this would be an interesting shape to build, like, I don't think you end up, you can waste a tremendous number of resources that way, sort of chasing things that don't actually do anything in the world. And I think it is really important to know, what does the world look like when you're done, right? What does it look like when you've done it right? And if you can't define what it looks like when you've done it right, then how could you ever possibly do it right?
Right. Yeah. So start with the outcome, and then walk back and create a product, right? So so what should be the thesis to build products? It should be about changing behavior, but can you walk through the process of how somebody should look about creating a product which could bring about a change, like Uber did, which was a better alternative to taxis. We always had taxis, but Uber was a better alternative to getting taxi from A location to B location. So somebody's trying to solve a problem. What should be their thesis?
Yeah, so I think that we already covered the first part, right? So imagine the world as you want it to be, right? And then I think the mistake that people make is, great, I know the world that I want it to be, now I'm going to start building product. I think there's still an essential step, which is understanding the world as it is, right? You have to understand sort of like the alternate reality and the current reality. And then and only then can you start to build a product, which is really a bridge between those two things. And so, the very first, at least a process that I have grown to run, we spend the first week writing a behavioral statement, which is really an articulation of the world as we want it to exist when we are successful. And then the next 2 weeks are about, well, why would anybody want to do that? And why are they not already doing it, right? So what is the current state of the world? Why are people motivated towards this thing? And why are they not already doing the behavior? And so if you have an accurate understanding of where you want to go, and both what the current world is and why it is that way, then and only then can you start to build a product where you're pulling the levers of, well, if I understand why the world is the way it is, I can change those whys to create a new what, right? And so I think that process of really understanding why is the world the way it is now is really essential to then building a product. And so then step 3 is really starting to build products. And I say, sort of the plural version, because you should never build a product first, right? Because that would imply that you know how to get from point A to point B. And almost certainly we don't, right? Almost certainly, even if you understood the world as it exists and the world as you want it to exist, it would be virtually impossible to, on the first try, get exactly the right thing. And so you want to start with sort of pilots where you're sort of exploring and testing in the world what, experimenting on what actually moves the behavior. And because you've articulated the behavior that you want and you can measure it, you then can see which of those sort of really super light things. And, I always tell people, don't do anything that takes more than, 3 or 4 weeks to get early results, right? You want things that are deliberately very light so that you can get, early signal and then start to double down on the ones that, that promise. Yeah, double down and double down and double down, right? And that's the thing I think people are familiar with this iteration, towards product market fit, right? Version of the world, where I think people screw up is they don't know where they want to go. They don't know why they are where they are. And so when they're iterating, they're sort of iterating blindly based on in the moment feedback, which, is sort of contextless, if that makes sense.
Got it. And so, it's been said that, life of any startup can be divided into 2 parts: before product market fit and after product market fit. But do you think a founder to product fit or founder to product to market fit is also important?
I do. You're right.
Okay.
I think, how do I say this well? The scientist in me wants to believe that it's all egalitarian, right? That anybody could build anything and be equally good at it. But I don't think that's true. And this is where the sort of science and art start to diverge a little bit, and the sort of applied behavioral science versus sort of in the lab behavioral science, right? In the lab behavioral science, it doesn't matter who does it, right? And it shouldn't matter who does it, right? Like that's the whole point of science. When you start to sort of apply this in the world, experience with an industry or a type of change, because you can't pilot everything, right? Wait, let me say it a different way. In the lab science, the theory is you could eventually pilot everything, right? Okay. And so the reason you can be agnostic of experimenter is because you can try every combination over time. In the world, right, you run out of resources before you do it. And so the difference between applied psychology and sort of lab psychology, I think, is that applied psychology has the additional constraint that is, and we can only try so many things before we run out of gas. And so I think that what having the right founder does and the right team does is, pare down the things that are probably wrong so you don't run out of gas before you have a chance to find the thing that's right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And do you believe, founders should have spent their 10,000 hours in that particular industry to solve the problem which they're trying to solve, like Travis or try to solve Uber, was trying to build Uber, but he was not from the same industry. So does it really matter, or do you think a founder who's passionate about a problem but is not from that same industry can also deliver good results?
Yeah, so I think that there's let me sort of answer that in two parts, right? The first one is like how much knowledge is the right knowledge. And I think surrounding yourself with the right knowledge is really, really important. What I, as pointed out by many people, if you're too deep in it, you just end up replicating the biases of the previous thing, right? Like one of the reasons that diversity is going to drive so much change in our world is because people with diverse perspectives aren't shackled by the existing perspective. Like the world as, the modern tech world was largely built by white guys, right? And that is a hindrance, right? Because we just replicate the same white guy viewpoint on the world instead of attacking it from new angles. And change comes from the introduction of new angles, right? And so I do think being an outsider to an industry can be very beneficial. That said, I think there's a difference between being an outsider to an industry or having enough perspective or getting enough perspective. Like I think a founder can be very expert at something, but then get enough people in the room who can challenge that thinking to sort of get there. So I think it depends a lot on, sort of how what kind of people you can surround yourself inside of or outside of the industry, right? So just because, for example, Travis didn't have a lot of transportation experience doesn't mean he didn't surround himself with people who did, right? And talk to people who did. And so I think that too often young people in particular reject experience, right? We see this ageism in hiring, that kind of stuff. I mean, I think that that's a big red flag to me, right? Because, just because people don't know everything doesn't mean they don't know nothing. I remember going at the Philly Art Museum to see a Salvador Dali exhibit. And it was really a wonderfully done exhibit. And they laid his work out chronologically, which I thought was a really interesting approach. And what was fascinating was, we all typically think of Dali in the sort of melting clocks version of his work. But in reality, like his early work as a student was copy everyone else, right? And so you can see him very deliberately, one by one, copy the style of the masters. And I think, in a sense, you earn the permission. I don't think it's about the 10,000 hours. I don't think it's about expertise, but I think you earn the permission to say that we should be doing something different by showing why doing the same thing doesn't work. Does that make sense? Right? Yeah. You can't reject the null hypothesis if you have not at least explored it, right? And so in the absence of additional data that tells us that there's room for improvement, doing the same thing will produce the same outcome. And so if you want to disrupt, you need to understand like why that you need to know enough about the current state of things to be able to understand what change looks like in a systematic way. Mere change, just I'm going to blow it up, unfocused change, to me seems nothing but a waste of resources, right? Way too many people come with disruption in mind. And they're like, I don't understand what the current thing is, and I don't understand why it is the way it is. All I know is I want to disrupt it. Right? All I know is I want to blow it up and be the CEO of something that is disruptive. And disruption is a side effect. Disruption isn't the point. You don't go into something being like, I'm going to fuck up the original. You go in sort of trying to improve, and if you happen to improve it, it may disrupt the individual, the sort of individual. I always, maybe I'll give the following example. I always sort of talk about if you want to figure out whether you're a good product person and how to be a good product person, imagine if you were working on a problem and you really worked on it and thought hard about it, and you woke up one morning and someone else had solved the problem. And if you're pissed, then you're probably not a very good product person, right? But if you say, great, now I can solve some other problem, that's a good product person, right? I am overjoyed when someone solves something that I've been working on, because it means I don't have to solve that anymore. I can go solve something else, right? Like there's plenty of problems out there. I'm like ecstatic when someone solves a problem that I think is a real problem in the world. And so, look, everybody has a natural knee-jerk, like, well, that's a bummer. I wish I had been the one who solved it, depending on your sort of competitive aim. But like, your ability to be a productive product person is how quickly you can move beyond that and say like, great, someone else solved it, move on. Right?
Got it. Yeah. So, Matt, in the book, you've talked about Uber as a product which has changed behavior, but you're also critical about how they ran the business, price surging, and all. So what is your viewpoint about Uber as a company? And do you think now, after the IPOs happened, do you think Uber is doing things which is it has already disrupted the transportation industry, but I just wanted to know your thoughts about the company and where they're running.
Yeah, I mean, so huge underperforming IPO, right? And I think that's reflective of the lack of diversity that the company was founded on, right? As you noted in the book, I sort of take Travis to task for his approaches to gender and other things, and I think that Uber to me has been very one note. They've made some successful growth into like Uber Eats and some other things, subscription services. Like, it's not like I don't think they've added features, and I appreciate their ability to continue to sort of move forward. But when you look at the long-term growth of a company, right, the long-term growth of a company is dependent on their ability to continually, bring a fresh set of behavioral goals to what they do. And, I don't think they've done a terribly good job of that recently. It's not to say they can't get it back. I know some people who work there now that, I have some confidence in, but I also think it's unavoidable that, until I think there's going to be a real reluctance in the marketplace to embrace Uber until Travis sort of is divested of his shares, right? Because at the moment, every time you take an Uber ride, you enrich someone who, for all intents and purposes, seems to be not a great person, right? And so when there are such handy alternatives like Lyft and others who seem to be doing much more egalitarian things, I think that little bit of sort of Travis is an asshole will continue to hold the company back. I think the best thing for Uber as a company would be to sort of cash Travis out and get him off the books.
Got it. And I wanted to understand, how you have large companies where like Google, they try to build Google Plus, or you have other products like Bing, but they did not get adapted. So how do successful companies look at building products when they're very large, they have large teams, or do you think it's only smaller teams which can look at disrupting or industry or try to solve something?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, Bing's actually a really good example. I think big companies can be disruptive and innovative, right? So like Google is on a path to be 100% of search. And these days, Bing owns about 30% of search, right? Like they've effectively halted Google's sort of path to total dominance. And they did that with a large team. And there's a reason there's only two really, real search engines, right? It's basically just Bing and Google. Like DuckDuckGo, Yahoo went away. It's just Bing and Google at the end of the day. And all of the things that aren't Google are powered by Bing, right? So like Yahoo search, right? All of those interfaces are powered by one of those two core engines. And that's because search is really expensive and really hard and really computationally intensive. And so you need a bunch of capital, right? And so, I do think there's this false notion that like only a small team can do it, when in fact, some things do require pretty big bets to be able to go and get the surface area that you need to sort of be disruptive. And so I hate this notion that big companies can't be disruptive. Now, one of the things that enables disruption in a big company is long-term bets, right? I think, I've been very public about the fact that I think the demand of Wall Street and analysts for quarter-over-quarter returns is just nonsense, right? I mean, I think if you look at Microsoft as a really great example, I worked there, so I have a lot of context, right? You're talking about a company that sat at 20 for 15 years, right? I mean, it sat at the same stock price forever, right? Gave off great dividends, whatever. But then very, very quickly, in the time that I was there, I think it went from 20 to like basically 100, right? And sort of 5x'd in the couple of years that I was there because those long-term bets started paying off, right? And, when you've got enough of a cash reserve, like take those long-term bets. And so I think the notion that we compensate CEOs on quarter-over-quarter returns, that the market pays attention to quarter-over-quarter returns, that analysts are solely focused on quarter-over-quarter returns. It really is about those big, long-term, capital-intensive bets that are about sort of permanent disruption. And so I think, that's where the big guys are poised to make some really big, sort of difference in the world. And, I think that can also start from small teams, right? You look at like Sally Krawcheck and Ellevest, right? Quickest robo-advisor to 100 million assets in assets under management, AUM. Because they looked at the field, they saw where there was a gap, and then they sort of charged deliberately into that gap. And so I think there's room for both big teams and small teams to sort of find out where there's a gap and go after it. And I think, the notion that anyone can't do it is really repugnant to me. I think that there's this notion sometimes that I always sort of cringe when people make statements about who can't do something. Now we can make statements about who might be better equipped to do something or the kind of things that might make it easier to do something. But I think if history has proven anything, it's proven that saying that a certain kind of people can't do something is inviting you being an idiot, right? Inviting history to prove you wrong.
Got it. Yeah, but don't you think in a large organization, bureaucracy and that slowness does come in, or do you think that if somebody's trying to work on a problem, they should be given a separate building, and they should be allowed to work on that product there?
I think you're always trading one thing for another, right?
Right.
And maybe some companies get 11 and some companies get 9, but at the end of the day, everybody gets the same amount of points, right? And the thing I would say is, Bing in the classroom is a great example. If I had done Bing in the classroom at a startup, pretending that I had a search engine, which is itself hard, but if I'd done Bing in the classroom at a startup, yeah, sure, it wouldn't have taken a year, 100%, right? It took, 6 times as long. I probably could have done it in a month or 2, right? It took 6 times as long to do it at Microsoft, but day 1, 7 million kids used it. So, right? That's a pretty serious trade-off. Yes, things at companies are bigger, and therefore slower. And when they are slow, it can be very frustrating to people who are involved. Lots of times I wanted to rage quit Microsoft because it was so slow and so hard for me to do. But they also, it's like a boxer. When you land a punch, man, you land a punch. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. You look at Foreman versus Ali, right? Foreman's just got tremendous punching power, right? Tremendous punching power. And you sort of know that if he manages to hit Ali, it's kind of over, right? And then you got, nimble, agile Ali dancing all around the ring, trying to sort of, work his punches in there. Doesn't have the stopping power that a Foreman has, but does sort of, have his own style and plays to his strengths. And I think, so that's what I'd say more than anything else is on any given day, either of those boxers could have won, right? It's really about who's playing to their strengths the best, right? And so if you're a big company, acknowledge you're going to be slow, try not to be too slow, but man, put a lot of wood behind the arrow when you're right? Because that's what, a startup can't do that, right? They get something out of the market, then they have to go raise money, which is a 6 months distraction in order to double down on that bet, right? But if you're Microsoft, as soon as something seems like it's working, go put $500 million on top of it.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So Matt, you written the book Start at the End. What made you write the book, and what can people learn from the book?
I mean, I'm hoping the book can teach everyone that they have the ability to be a behavioral scientist, that's a place that everyone can play, and you don't have to be only a specific kind of person or have a PhD to sort of attack that. If behavior is your outcome and science is your process, then you're a behavioral scientist, right? By definition. I wrote the book because, I travel a lot to give talks. I've always given free talks. I don't charge. And as I have a small child, I got an almost 4-year-old, as the travel became more and more onerous and took me away from my family, I wanted something that could do a better job of speaking one to many. And I think a book is a really great way of sort of speaking one to many. And so that was sort of the genesis of the book for me, was just getting off the road a little bit.
Got it. And so the book is launching on 11th June, and you a lot of interesting mini studies simple nudges which can encourage women to ask for raises and promotions, and how the decline of cigarette smokers led to killing of one of Camel Cigarettes icons, Joe Camel. So do you think it's only the book is positioned for product managers or people who are creating or designing products, or do you think even people who want to change their habits, or they would want to change the behavior would want to look at reading this book?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, right? I certainly wrote it rather, with sort of collective behavior change in mind. I wrote it intending to create things that change people's behaviors other than my own, that change groups' behavior. But the nice thing about science is that it can scale up or down endlessly, right? Because it's based on underlying principles. Those underlying principles don't change. And so, there's a world in which you could effectively read the book as a self-help book and think about how you would change your own behavior, right? There's no reason you couldn't say, hey, what's the behavioral statement? What inhibiting and promoting pressures shape my existing behavior? How am I going to go change those pressures, right? There's no reason you couldn't think of it that way. It isn't how it's marketed. It isn't how I talk about it. It isn't how I thought about it when I was writing it. But that's one of the beauties of science, is that it works at any scale. And so, I think there's more than one way to read the book. And my hope is that it is accessible. I mean, you've read it. My hope is that it is accessible enough that sort of anyone could access it. It's deliberately not, sort of too over academic, right? I don't expect people to have, the PhD to be able to read the damn thing. It's got cursing in it. It's deliberately provocative. It's deliberately phrased in such a way that it can appeal to populations that might not normally read this kind of book. And I do that quite deliberately, because I want the world to recognize that good things come in all sorts of packages, right? That dismissing somebody because they curse, or because they have an accent, or because they speak in a patois or a dialect, or use slang, or look a certain way or dress a certain way, if you dismiss knowledge because of that, you are missing out on something. And so I want to write a book that wears a big old belt buckle and cowboy boots like me.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. So let's quickly do the top 3. What's your favorite business book?
It's interesting. So I have a standing no nonfiction policy. So I haven't read the business books that most people have read, because I stopped reading nonfiction a long time ago. And the reason for that is there are so many amazing ways in the world to get nonfiction content these days, right? Like, you can listen to podcasts, you can talk to authors, you can read blog posts online. Like, nonfiction content is more accessible now than it's ever been, and it's accessible in a huge variety of formats. Fiction, on the other hand, really does thrive best in either some visual medium, like sort of a play or a movie, or a book. And the other thing that's really interesting is nonfiction can always be summarized, right? Guy Kawasaki can come on your show and summarize his book. And the very fact that he can summarize this book, or that you've asked me to summarize my book, suggests that there is some simpler version of my book that is non-reductive, right? And fiction simply isn't that way, right? If you tried to summarize Romeo and Juliet, that would be a very impoverished sort of view of Romeo and Juliet. Trying to summarize a painting or a book or, a work of imagination inherently reduces it. And so I think that that's, for me, a key difference. So I try and read religiously fiction. And so, probably my best fiction business book is, there's a fictionalized series of books written by James Clavell that are kind of about a real company, Jardines, in Hong Kong, that I think are a really interesting, so like Noble House by James Clavell, I'll give you as like a fictionalized business book that I think has a lot to say about business. Or the real one is King Rat, which is James Clavell's again, fictionalized version of POWs in Shaanxi, internment camp, prisoner of war camp. And yeah, I think it is a fascinating look at the great sort of question at the center of capitalism, which is that there end up being winners and losers. And what are the implications of those winners and losers?
Got it. So it's King Rat and Noble House is what you said, right?
Yeah, both by James Clavell. But King Rat, I mean, is I think a fantastic business book that not enough people read.
Oh, okay. I'll put that in the show notes. If you could go back in time, we started working on building products and you got interested in behavioral change. What is the one thing you would have focused on?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll say I try not to do these time travel exercises because the person that knows that I would travel in time is the person who has gone through it, right? And every experience has something to teach us. I have to say, I was put in a very senior position very early on in my startup career, right? I sort of started as the head of product, coming to it as a scientist, which obviously had like tremendous advantages in a variety of ways. But I really wish I'd got a chance to work for people more, right? Every time I get a chance to work for a new person, especially someone whose viewpoint I have not been exposed to. I've learned a ton from working for women. I've learned a ton from working from people from underrepresented groups. I wish I'd had more of those experiences. I hope in the rest of my career, I get more chances to work for people with really different viewpoints from mine that can teach me to be a different and better person.
Interesting. And do you have any favorite online tool, for example, Gmail, Slack?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, it's interesting. I like Gmail, especially the new predictive text feature. I think is brilliant, because I really do think. Isn't that I think that like the future of bots talking to bots is quite the right thing, but I do think that like everyone has their own style, but that style is predictable, and so assisted tools. Not tools that write email for you, but tools that suggest things, I think are really great. Human hybrid bots, I think, are really, really great. And so I think Gmail these days continues to introduce innovations that I think are great. And Excel. So yeah, I think that Excel is an amazingly powerful and simple. It manages to be both powerful and simple, and I think that's amazing, right? I think it's a little bit hard for a total layperson to approach, but one of the things I like about it is like, you could do a 1-day Excel boot camp and do an amazing number of things with data, right? Really simple statistical analysis, really simple visualization, right? Like, and you compare that to people are so hot on coding right now. Right. So hot on coding. But even if you take a relatively simple language like Python, right, a 1-day boot camp in Python or a 1-day boot camp in Excel, I can do a hell of a lot more in Excel. Right. Excel is like SQL and Python and visualization libraries all wrapped up into one in a pretty easy to use interface. And that's all a lot of people ever need to do. And so for me, at least, like I would love, I'm glad when people learn the basics of coding and how computers work, but I would love for more people to know how to use Excel.
Got it. Yeah, and so Matt, you releasing a book, start at the end. Where can people read the book, and and what is the best way people can reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can get it at booksellers near you, right? Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever you like. I do, the ebook is out there, will be out there in the wild. And I got a tremendous opportunity to do the audiobook myself. So it's all authentic Matt Wallaert cursing, which was a lot of fun. And so, I think if you're at all inclined to audiobooks, I think the audiobook version is probably the best version. If you like this podcast, if you like hearing things, it's such an approachable book that I think, some books it's really hard to hear. Right, because they're so complex and they're so dense. I think this is such a hopefully approachable book that hearing it directly from me is really a great way. So I guess that that's the direction I would sort of push people. But you should be able to get it on almost any platform. The miracle of modern publishing. It's being translated into a bunch of different languages. I sort of lost track of all the different countries, Korean and Chinese and Vietnamese and all sorts of crazy places. And, so hopefully there's even a version in whatever language your listeners feel most comfortable into. And I know that the publisher continues to push on that.
Awesome. And did you have to do a lot of retakes when you were, recording your own book?
No, I actually had amazing, and I was sort of proud of this. They had scheduled 3 days. I did it in a day and a half, and they measure you on words per hour, basically how fast can you read. And by the second day, I was up to 65,000 or 6,500 words an hour, which was like, the producer was like, I've never seen anybody like do a first time reading that fast. And then I had no retakes. So, a week or two later, I sort of said, how's it going? What do you need me to retake? And they were like, it's all great. You don't have to retake anything. And I was like, okay, well, that's, and so I had a lot of fun just doing the reading. It is profoundly a weird experience if anyone's ever sort of done it. I mean, you're locked in a darkened room, right, in a studio. And, somewhere outside is a producer and an audio engineer, and all of a sudden, sometimes the voice of God just comes on and says, "Can we get that line again?" Right? But you're really just like sitting in a room reading to yourself something that you wrote. It's very much like, it's like sort of a flashback to being a teenager. You're like, I'm reading my own poetry to myself in a dark room, right? And then the voice of God says, "No, read it again." And you're like, okay, I'll read it again.
Interesting. So, Matt will put that in the show notes. And thank you very much for coming on to the show. I really enjoyed speaking to you, Matt.
Rowan, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate the thoughtful questions and just having a good conversation. And I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Life Self-Mastery podcast, where we teach you how to start and grow your online business. For more information, visit Rohit's blog at www.lifeselfmastery.com.